There's a moment after betrayal that most men can't quite explain. She's still there, but something feels hollow. Her eyes don't rest on you the same way. Her warmth feels delayed, almost rehearsed. And the unsettling truth is this: your intuition is picking up on something real. Because after a woman betrays you, her behavior doesn't stay the same. It can't. And by the end of this conversation, you'll understand why that change is so predictable and why most men misunderstand it completely. Before we go deeper, take a second to breathe with me. If this kind of psychological clarity matters to you, clarity that helps you understand women without resentment or confusion, then quietly support this space by liking the video and subscribing. Not for me, but because the algorithm only keeps conversations like this alive when thoughtful men show up. Now listen carefully. Betrayal doesn't just break trust between two people, it fractures the internal self image of the person who caused it. Most men assume that after betrayal, a woman either becomes cold out of guilt or defensive out of fear. That's only the surface. The deeper change happens inside her psychological alignment, and that shift leaks into her behavior in subtle but unmistakable ways. Here's the first thing that changes: her emotional timing no longer syncs with yours. Before betrayal, emotional responses tend to be organic, laughter arrives naturally, concern shows up without prompting, affection flows without calculation. After betrayal, her responses often become slightly delayed, slightly measured, not because she doesn't care, but because part of her is now monitoring herself. She's thinking before she feels. This internal monitoring creates a quiet distance. You may notice she listens but doesn't fully lean in. She responds but rarely expands. It feels like she's present yet guarded. That's not accidental. Psychologically, when a woman betrays someone she once bonded with, her mind begins splitting into two tracks. One, managing guilt or justification, the other, maintaining stability. And that split costs emotional energy, so she conserves it. Another change appears in how she handles conflict. Before betrayal, disagreements may have felt emotionally charged but sincere. After betrayal, her conflict style often becomes flatter or oddly controlled. She may avoid deep emotional confrontation, not because she's peaceful, but because depth risks exposure. Strong emotional exchanges can trigger guilt, self-reflection, or fear of being seen clearly. So, she keeps things on the surface. Notice this carefully. This doesn't always mean she's trying to deceive you further. Often it means she's trying to protect herself from internal collapse. When a woman betrays, she has to reconcile two identities: the version of herself she believed in and the version who crossed a line. That internal contradiction changes how she shows up with you. There's also a subtle shift in validation dynamics. She may become more sensitive to criticism or strangely indifferent to praise. Compliments don't land the same way. Corrections feel heavier. That's because her internal moral balance is already unstable. Any external input threatens to tip it. And here's the part most men miss and misinterpret: her changed behavior is not always about losing feelings for you. Often it's about losing clarity about herself. When you understand this, you stop chasing explanations and start observing patterns. You stop arguing with confusion and start grounding yourself in reality. And that shift, your shift, is where real power begins. Stay with me. What comes next is where most men finally see the truth they've been sensing all along. After betrayal, one of the most noticeable changes isn't what she says, it's what she no longer offers. Effort becomes selective, emotional generosity becomes conditional, and this is where many men start blaming themselves, thinking, if I just do more, she'll come back to who she was. But psychologically, what you're witnessing is not laziness or indifference. It's emotional withdrawal driven by inner conflict. When a woman betrays someone she was bonded to, her nervous system goes into a quiet self-protection mode. Not dramatic, Not obvious, subtle. She starts regulating closeness. Too much intimacy threatens to awaken guilt. Too much distance risks consequences, so she hovers in between. This is why her effort often becomes inconsistent. One day she's attentive, almost overly kind. The next day she's distant, distracted, unreachable. That inconsistency isn't random, it's the external expression of an internal tug-of war. Part of her wants to restore stability. Another part wants to avoid emotional depth, so she oscillates. For a man on the receiving end, this inconsistency is deeply destabilizing. You start analyzing texts, replaying conversations, looking for logic where emotion is fractured, and the more you try to figure her out, the more you lose your footing. Another behavioral shift appears in how she handles responsibility. After betrayal, many women unconsciously minimize accountability, not always by denying what happened, but by reframing it. Language changes. It just happened. I was overwhelmed. I didn't mean for it to go that far. These aren't necessarily lies, they're psychological buffers. Her mind is attempting to reduce the emotional weight of her actions so she can continue functioning without internal collapse. This reframing often comes with a subtle emotional detachment from the consequences. She may acknowledge your pain intellectually, but struggle to sit with it emotionally, not because she lacks empathy, but because staying present with your hurt forces her to confront her own internal fracture, so she distances. You may also notice a shift in how she seeks reassurance. Sometimes she asks questions that seem almost backward, questions about whether you still care, whether you trust her, whether you think things can be normal again. This isn't manipulation, it's a destabilized sense of self looking for external grounding. But here's the critical insight: reassurance given too freely at this stage often backfires. When you rush to comfort her emotional instability, you unintentionally teach her nervous system that the consequences of betrayal can be emotionally outsourced. She feels relief without resolution, stability without repair, and that delays genuine accountability. Another change appears in her body language and presence. Eye contact may shorten, touch may feel less rooted, more habitual. She may initiate closeness but struggle to sustain it. This is because betrayal creates a subconscious fear of being seen too clearly. Sustained intimacy invites scrutiny, and scrutiny threatens the internal story she's trying to hold together, and so she keeps moments brief. Here's the quiet truth most men don't want to hear, but desperately need. After betrayal, the relationship dynamic is no longer about love versus loss. It becomes about alignment versus avoidance. And until that internal avoidance is resolved, her behavior will continue to feel unpredictable. Your role right now is not to chase consistency from someone who hasn't found it within herself. Your role is to become consistent within yourself. After betrayal, there's a psychological change that rarely gets talked about, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. Her respect calibration shifts, not in loud ways, in quiet ones. The way she speaks to you, the way she listens, the way she assumes how available you'll be emotionally. Before betrayal, respect is usually grounded in emotional safety and mutual regard. After betrayal, that grounding is shaken. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When a woman feels internally conflicted about her actions, she often tests the emotional boundaries around her, subconsciously, not strategically. This is where many men feel something is off but can't articulate it. She may interrupt you more than before, dismiss concerns more quickly, or respond to vulnerability with practicality instead of presence, not cruelty, compression. Your emotional expressions get shortened, redirected, or neutralized. This isn't because she suddenly lacks care, it's because deep emotional engagement threatens her internal balance, so she lowers the emotional resolution of the relationship. At the same time, you might notice something confusing, moments where she appears unusually confident or even emotionally elevated. She speaks with certainty. She asserts independence more strongly. This can feel like arrogance or indifference, but psychologically, it's often compensation. When guilt destabilizes the self, the psyche sometimes swings toward overassertion to regain control. This over-assertion often shows up as emotional self-centering. Conversations begin to orbit her feelings, her stress, her confusion. Your pain becomes acknowledged but not held. You're heard but not carried. And if you gently push for deeper understanding, she may become defensive or emotionally fatigued. This is not because your pain is inconvenient, it's because sitting with it threatens the fragile internal structure she's using to stay functional. Another key shift happens in how she perceives your strength. After betrayal, many women subconsciously scan for signs of whether a man has lost his internal stability. If she senses emotional collapse, over-pursuit, or self-abandonment, something changes, not because she wants power, but because polarity dissolves when one person loses grounding. This is where men often make their biggest mistake. They try to earn reassurance by becoming overly available, overly understanding, overly patient. They explain their pain in increasingly detailed ways, hoping clarity will restore connection. But emotional overexposure at this stage often lowers perceived stability. And stability, not perfection, is what creates respect. There's also a subtle shift in how she responds to silence. Before betrayal, silence may have felt connected, comfortable, shared. After betrayal, silence can feel tense or strangely relieving to her because silence reduces emotional demand. It gives her nervous system a break from managing internal conflict. If you notice she seems calmer when things are less emotionally intimate, that's not a good sign and not a reason to push harder. It's a signal that emotional depth is currently unsafe for her psyche. Here's the crucial insight. Respect doesn't disappear overnight after betrayal, but it becomes conditional on emotional equilibrium. If you remain grounded, self-contained, and clear, respect has space to stabilize. If you chase emotional resolution from someone avoiding it internally, respect erodes quietly. And the most revealing shift comes when she senses that you are no longer orbiting her emotional state. That's when her behavior changes in a way that tells you everything you need to know without her saying a word. There is a moment after betrayal when a woman realizes something before a man does. She senses whether the relationship still has gravity or whether it's slowly losing its pull, and her behavior at this stage becomes especially revealing because it's no longer driven by confusion alone. It's driven by assessment. This is when you may notice a shift in her curiosity about you. She asks fewer questions about your inner world. Not out of disinterest, but because curiosity requires emotional openness, and openness risks self-exposure. Instead, conversations become logistical, practical, or surface-level plans, schedules, responsibilities. The relationship starts to feel organized rather than connected. This transition often alarms men. They feel like they're being phased out emotionally, but psychologically, what's happening is more nuanced. She's testing whether the bond can exist with reduced emotional intensity, whether the relationship can survive on structure instead of intimacy. And that test matters. Another change appears in how she reacts to your emotional independence. If you become calmer, less reactive, less eager to fix things immediately, she notices, and her response is rarely neutral. Sometimes she becomes more attentive, almost drawn back in. Other times she becomes uneasy or subtly anxious, not because she wants chaos, but because your independence removes a familiar reference point. When a woman betrays and the man remains emotionally centered, it forces her psyche to confront a question she's been avoiding. Am I still in control of the emotional landscape here? This doesn't mean she wants control. It means uncertainty triggers reflection. You may also notice changes in how she expresses affection. It becomes more symbolic than spontaneous. She does things that signal care, checking in, small gestures, but avoids deeper emotional presence. This is often mistaken for improvement, but symbolic affection without emotional repair is a holding pattern, not healing. Her nervous system is maintaining stability, not rebuilding trust. There's also a subtle behavioral shift in how she discusses the future. She may avoid long-term language or speak about the future in vague, non-committal terms, not rejection, ambiguity. This ambiguity allows her to stay without fully reinvesting emotionally. It keeps options open. Internally, even if she hasn't acted on them externally. For men, this ambiguity is agonizing, but here's where psychological maturity becomes essential. Pushing for clarity from someone avoiding internal clarity rarely works. It creates pressure without resolution. What does work is observing whether her actions begin aligning with emotional repair or whether they remain focused on emotional management. One of the most telling signs at this stage is how she responds when you stop over-explaining yourself. When you speak clearly but briefly, when you express boundaries without anger, when you no longer chase emotional reassurance, this often creates a quiet shift. She either leans forward emotionally or pulls back further. Both outcomes are information, and information is power. Because after betrayal, behavior becomes a mirror not of what she says she wants, but of what she's capable of sustaining emotionally. The relationship doesn't collapse all at once, it reveals itself. At this stage, something subtle but decisive begins to happen inside her. The internal story she's been telling herself starts to solidify, and once that narrative sets, her behavior becomes more consistent, but not necessarily warmer. After betrayal, a woman eventually chooses one of two internal paths. Either she begins integrating what happened, taking responsibility emotionally, not just verbally, or she restructures the relationship in a way that allows her to avoid deep accountability while maintaining stability. This choice isn't announced, it's lived. You'll see it first in her emotional availability. If she's integrating, her presence slowly deepens, conversations regain texture, she becomes more willing to sit in discomfort, yours and hers. She doesn't rush past difficult moments or neutralize them with logic. There's a sense of sincerity even when things are heavy. If she's avoiding, her availability becomes predictably limited. Not cold, just cap. She shows up enough to keep the relationship functional, but not enough to rebuild emotional intimacy. The ceiling is low and stays there. This is where many men exhaust themselves trying to break through that ceiling. They increase patience, increase understanding, increase effort, but emotional ceilings created by avoidance aren't broken by pressure. They're reinforced by it. The more you push for depth, the more she relies on emotional containment. Another change appears in how she frames the relationship. An integrating woman speaks in terms of repair. She acknowledges damage and speaks about growth carefully, humbly. An avoiding woman speaks in terms of moving on. Let's not dwell. Let's just be normal. Why keep reopening things? These phrases aren't malicious, they're defensive. They signal a desire for emotional closure without emotional processing. There's also a noticeable shift in how she responds to your boundaries. If you begin protecting your time, your energy, your emotional availability, an integrating woman respects it, even if it's uncomfortable. An avoiding woman may feel threatened by it. She might interpret boundaries as punishment, distance, or lack of care. This reaction tells you everything because emotional maturity recognizes boundaries as structure. Emotional avoidance sees them as risk. You may also notice a change in how she engages with accountability over time. True integration shows up in consistency. Her actions align with her words. There's follow-through, small but steady changes. Avoidance shows up as circular conversations, apologies without evolution, understanding without adjustment. And here's the hardest truth for many men. Love alone does not determine which path she chooses. Internal capacity does. You cannot reason someone into emotional integration. You cannot sacrifice yourself into their growth, and you cannot stabilize a relationship by destabilizing yourself. At this stage, your groundedness becomes the deciding factor. Not because it controls her, but because it clarifies reality. When you stop trying to manage her emotional state, the relationship either deepens naturally or reveals its limitations. And that revelation, painful as it may be, is clarity. What remains now is the final shift, the one that determines whether betrayal becomes a turning point or an ending in slow motion. There is a final behavioral change that appears after betrayal, one that most men feel long before they consciously recognize it. It shows up not in conflict, not in distance, but in emotional alignment. You begin to sense whether she is truly walking beside you again or merely occupying the same space. After a woman betrays and chooses avoidance, something quiet happens. Her emotional energy stops flowing toward the relationship. She's present, but not invested. She participates, but doesn't contribute depth. The relationship becomes something she maintains, not something she nourishes. You feel this in the absence of initiative. She no longer initiates emotional repair. She responds when necessary, but rarely leads. Growth becomes reactive, not intentional. This is a crucial distinction. When emotional integration is happening, effort has direction. When avoidance has settled in, effort has limits. And this is where many men make one last mistake. They wait. They wait for time to heal what accountability didn't. They wait for consistency to return without structure. They wait for her to realize what she has. But waiting without self-alignment slowly erodes self-respect. Here's the psychological truth. When a man remains present but internally unentered, the relationship loses polarity. Not attraction, polarity. The dynamic that creates movement, tension, growth. Without it, things stagnate. On the other hand, when you begin realigning with yourself, your values, your boundaries, your sense of direction, something inevitable occurs. The dynamic shifts. If she is capable of emotional integration, your stability becomes an anchor. It gives her nervous system permission to settle. She leans in, not dramatically. Gradually, her behavior becomes more transparent, more accountable, more engaged. If she is not capable, your stability becomes a mirror. It reflects what she cannot meet. And in that reflection, she often becomes restless, detached, or subtly disengaged. Neither outcome is failure. One is repair, the other is revelation. Another sign at this stage is how she responds to your silence. Not withdrawal, but grounded silence. When you stop filling space with explanations, reassurances, or emotional labor, her behavior clarifies. Some women step forward, others step away emotionally while staying physically present. This distinction matters more than words ever could because emotional truth always reveals itself in behavior when pressure is removed. At this point, you no longer need answers. You have patterns. You no longer need promises. You have consistency or the lack of it. And most importantly, you no longer need to convince yourself of anything. Your nervous system knows. Betrayal doesn't just test a relationship, it tests identity, hers, and yours. And the man who emerges grounded, clear, and self-aligned does not lose regardless of the outcome. What remains now is the final understanding, the one that determines how you carry this experience forward without bitterness, without confusion, and without repeating the same pain again. Here is the understanding that changes everything quietly, permanently. After betrayal, her behavior does not change to punish you, confuse you, or teach you a lesson. It changes because her internal relationship with herself has changed. And once you truly grasp that, you stop personalizing what was never about your worth. If she integrates, her behavior softens and deepens because her identity regains coherence. If she avoids, her behavior stabilizes at a lower emotional depth because coherence would require confronting who she became. Both paths are about self-preservation, not about you being enough or not enough. This is why chasing explanations never brings peace. Peace comes from recognizing patterns and responding with alignment. The most psychologically healthy response to betrayal is not control, punishment, or overforgiveness. It is grounded observation paired with self-respect. When you stop trying to extract certainty from someone who is uncertain within themselves, you reclaim your center. And something remarkable happens. You begin to see her behavior clearly without distortion. You notice whether her presence brings calm or confusion, whether connection feels mutual or managed, whether effort flows or is rationed. These signals are not subtle once you stop overriding them. This is where maturity replaces hope, not cynical resignation, clarity. You may realize that her behavior never truly returned to emotional alignment, or you may notice that slowly, authentically, it did. Both realizations hurt in different ways, but only one requires you to abandon yourself. And here's the quiet truth most men were never taught. You are not meant to endure emotional instability in the name of loyalty. You are not meant to sacrifice your inner balance to prove love. And you are not meant to stay in dynamics where clarity is permanently postponed. Betrayal is not the end of trust. Self-betrayal is when you choose to remain grounded, when you stop chasing emotional repair from someone who hasn't repaired themselves. You change the trajectory of your life. You become someone whose presence has weight, whose silence has meaning, whose boundaries are felt, not announced. And whether she rises to meet that or fades away emotionally becomes secondary, because you no longer measure your value by her behavior. You measure it by your alignment. If this conversation helped you see something more clearly about her, about yourself, or about relationships in general, then quietly support this space. Like the video, subscribe if these conversations matter to you, not for numbers, but because thoughtful content only survives when thoughtful men choose it. And remember this: the right outcome after betrayal is not reunion or separation. It is clarity without self-loss. That is the standard.